The number of deaths here in the United States has just crossed 100,000.
Seeing tear gas being used. Here we go, they're moving through again.
In hindsight, everything's 2020, and we shouldn't have been anywhere near what was going on.
21st century history is not one of my strong points. Too depressing.
In case you hadn't noticed, things are pretty shit right now. If you're watching this somewhere down the line past the current moment, at the time of recording this video, a few short weeks ago, 100,000 people officially died from COVID-19 and in the United States, and the pandemic continues to rage across the globe almost unchecked. In the United States, not too long ago, a black man named George Floyd was murdered by police officers in Minneapolis. In the wake of his death, protests and marches popped up in every major city, which would have been inspiring if many of these had not turned violent due to police intervention. Journalists have been shot with rubber bullets, punched by cops, and in Washington, D.C., some priests were tear gassed just so our president could pose in front of a church with a Bible. I'm sure he reads that every day. It would be something of an understatement to say that things are shitty right now. But let's be honest, I'm not really privy to that. I don't know how to put that. The most I've seen of the protests has been through computer screen on Twitter. I wasn't even supposed to be here in the United States for most of it. You see, back in January, I flew to Seville, Spain to spend a semester abroad and practice some Spanish. But then in mid-March, things got pretty bad in Spain with COVID, so I was forced to flee Spain to the United States. I got here just in time to see the shit hit the fan back home too. And thanks to some health issues in the family, none of us in this house can risk going almost anywhere. If it weren't for the grocery store, I probably wouldn't be leaving the house. So what have I been doing? Watching Star Trek, mainly. A friend once remarked to me that for her, watching Star Trek was like eating meatloaf. It's the TV equivalent of comfort food, and it's the same for me. There's something really soothing about watching a TV show so positively utopian that people like each other and work together. There are always conflicts, always problems, but in Star Trek's world, we fight together to solve those problems. In one Deep Space Nine episode, Dr. Julian Bashir is so appalled by the fact that in the United States, in the 21st century, we hid our problems behind walls rather than solving them.
How could they have let things get so bad?
In a time where basic human decency seems in very short supply, and I am increasingly fueled by rage and Earl Grey tea, it is positively refreshing. It's Deep Space Nine I wanted to talk about today. When I was younger, I was never really a fan of Deep Space Nine, and it wasn't for any particular reason. It's just that I never really had it around. In a time before streaming video, you watched whatever the library and the video store and your parents' shelf had to offer, and DS9 was just never around. I never sought it out. But since I have nothing better to do with my time, and my parents and my friends will only tolerate me for complaining about not being in Spain for so long, I started to watch it. I've only seen bits and pieces before, but on this session I was really struck by the depth and the nuance of the stories. It's a lot darker and more complex than the other Star Trek shows of its era. but it also deeply understood what Star Trek was about. Now today, I'd like to talk about one episode in particular, and what it has to say for a future that hasn't really learned the lessons Gene Roddenberry had hoped it would. It's no secret that Star Trek is a show about optimism. It's a franchise about overcoming ourselves, about growing and becoming more. It's a show set in a time where differences of color, race, sexuality, and gender no longer really matter. But this episode doesn't take place in that future. In fact, you can almost say it takes place far beyond those stars. See what I did there?
Hey, that was almost a joke. Keep that up, David. Maybe someday people will actually laugh.
In each Star Trek show, there's at least one episode that's entirely removed from the events of the rest of the series. More than usually allowed by episodic television, these one-off stories allow the series to talk about issues a little bit different from what they normally do, and it allows the writers to flex their storytelling muscles a little bit. In The Next Generation, Picard lives the life of a scientist on a Doom's planet, and then he plays the flute. In Voyager, Catherine Janeway learns about her ancestors' place in history, discovering the truth behind the myths she built herself up on. And in Deep Space Nine, Captain Benjamin Sisko experiences visions of a black science fiction writer in the 1950s called Benny Russell. Avery Brooks not only stars in the lead role, but he directs as well.
Far Beyond the Stars of Ira Bear talked to me one day and said, well, I'm going to do this story. However, we'd love for you to direct it. However, you're in it a lot. And he said, well, are you willing to do it? I said, sure, absolutely.
For a reason.
Sisko faces his greatest enemy.
Things are going to change. They have to.
Racism.
The framing story of Far Beyond the Stars is about Captain Benjamin Sisko feeling disillusioned with his role and his job in Deep Space Nine. All of his friends are dying. He feels like the war is going nowhere. He feels stuck. And in the middle of this, he experiences a vision from these aliens called the Prophets, where he lives the life of Benny Russell, a struggling science fiction writer living in 1950s New York. In addition to the everyday struggle, everyday experience of just being black and dealing with racism, having to deal with cops. Geez, that sounds familiar. In addition to all that, Benny struggles with racism at his job. He is told to stay home along with their female writer the day that the writing staff is supposed to appear in a photo. His editor refuses to print his story featuring a black captain of a space station. When he is finally persuaded to publish it, the newspaper owner cancels the whole edition and he is promptly fired. Through all of this, Benny sees visions of DS9 and a street preacher tells him his role is important in things to come. Later in the episode, his friend is murdered by the cops, and at the scene, Benny is beaten to a pulp for no good reason. Again, nothing familiar to what we're talking about right now. In the end, he suffers a nervous breakdown and is institutionalized. After that, we flash back to the 24th century, and Benjamin Sisko and his father talk about dreams and discuss, in question, who is really dreaming whom. There are several ways you can read this episode, but the one I want to concentrate on is the meta theme of the story, the way the writers use the metaphor of a black writer dreaming of a better future in the 1950s as an argument for the purpose of the show. As I already said, Star Trek makes no secret of its progressive politics. Various episodes of the show deal with environmentalism, gender, sexuality, and other topics. But one topic that it is pretty silent about is race. Now that's generally, there are exceptions. And when it does talk about those themes I mentioned earlier, it's usually through a metaphor or a 24th century parable of modern day problems. It's never about the same problems that plague us today, unless it's a time travel story. Now, in my research for this piece, I did find some articles criticizing this version of progressive politics. Alan Kwan, for instance, criticized Star Trek for its cultural and racial homogenization. In his opinion, Star Trek's privileging of whiteness and Western cultural norms shows an implicit bias. It implies that the utopian project of Star Trek is one built on the values and norms of white people and Western culture, and peace and harmony between races can only be achieved on a world in which everybody follows that culture. Many people besides him, like the show's own writers, have chafed against this version of the future. They've criticized this. They've tried to include more cultural diversity in these stories. And besides, if people have no cultural differences or individual goals or ideas, do we even have a show? What do we write about? Without diversity, cultural, intellectual, ethnic, where are we? And I do find these criticisms valid, but I also think of it as a bit of a shallow reading of the series. The inclusion of Sulu as a Japanese character and Chekhov as a Russian, our main enemy of the time, shows the commitment from the beginning of the series to that diversity. What it is guilty of is a kind of visual and character-based shorthand which biases towards our own cultural norms. What makes Far Beyond the Stars special is the way it responds to these criticisms. In order to make the story more palatable to his editor, Benny Russell makes the concession that the story in which a black man is captain of a space station be a dream of an ordinary black man in present day, a hope of a better future. I think you can tell where this is going, and if you can't, boy, listen up. You can see the writer's room of Benny as a co-workers as a rough outline allegory for Deep Space Nine's writer room. The stories they produce are their dreams, their hopes of a better future, but instead of being the dream of a white World War II veteran and former police officer, it is the dream of a black man.
You know, the people talked about it was about racism, but maybe so, maybe not. This is America, more importantly. And you know, and racism is one of the things that we deal with. Just like sexism is one of the things we deal with. I mean, those things are inextricably connected to who we are. And when we start to talk about who we are, we have to face those issues in terms of behavior and what people do.
In a gripping monologue at the end of the story, Benny yells at those around him as his world crumbles before him. The one thing they cannot take away from him is his dream, an idea. At the end of the episode, as Captain Sisko recovers from the dream, he wonders who was dreaming who. Sisko dreaming Benny, or Benny dreaming Sisko. The message here is clear. It's a defense of the ideology of Star Trek. It's a defense of that defiantly utopian message, warts and all. In spite of the nefarious characters and shades of grey of DS9, the dream is the same. It's still valuable. In a world where nothing ever seems to go our way, where nothing is perfect, Star Trek can seem as both an inspiration and a call to action. The very criticism that is leveled at it, the lack of diversity, the way everybody gets along, is, to some extent, the point. Star Trek is nothing more than the dream, or Benny's dream. It's what we make of it. It's the possible future we hold in our hearts no matter how bad it gets, because that's the one thing they can't take away from us. If there's anything that's really utopian about Star Trek, it's that they don't grapple with our modern day problems. There is no racism among humans, and nobody goes hungry. Nobody dies because they can't afford medical care. Almost everybody has a chance to do or be who they want to be. This doesn't mean that they don't have problems. It simply means that their problems are different from ours. In an era where I honestly find very few reasons to be proud of my country, it's comforting to go back to Star Trek. The America I could be proud of is the one we constantly promise, but we never deliver on. Star Trek is a uniquely American piece of media because it's here to remind us to keep building that vision. Beyond the commentary specific to the Star Trek franchise, this episode also provides an ahead-of-its-time argument for inclusion and diversity in storytelling. The episode is about a group of writers struggling to tell their stories. Women and people of color are excluded. This is very similar to the state of writers' rooms for TV shows even to this day. Diverse writers' rooms are the exception. And a lot of white people don't seem to get why we need, say, a female director to direct Wonder Woman, or a black man to direct Black Panther. Now, ignoring for a second the obvious fact that minority groups don't have the same opportunities that white men do. Far Beyond the Stars shows that it's important for people to be able to tell stories about themselves. Telling stories about yourself, or about people like you, is how you understand the world, how you understand who you are and where you come from in that world. For people who are marginalized, it provides hope and identity. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? I decided to talk about Star Trek with you today because I really haven't been doing that much else. Playing video games every Friday with friends, shameless plug, tune in on Friday nights, is fun and all, but doing nothing else makes me feel pretty useless. What good does watching or telling stories do us? Now, not all that much directly. For actual material change, we need direct action. We see that happening right now. And I guess I'm just here talking to you to explain why we do anything besides that. Why do we go to the theater? Why do we watch anything besides for entertainment? Because it stimulates our imagination. Because it can inspire us to be better, or to cause change that makes the world better. And honestly, I don't really know if I'm making anything better by watching Star Trek at 2 in the morning, but I'd like to imagine that I am. A guy can hope, can't he?
I guess I'm just here talking to you to explain why we do anything besides that. Why do we go to the theater? Why do we watch anything?